The opening round of the MotoGP season is in the books, and Marc Marquez has once again proved just why he's the greatest racer of all time. Welcome to the Paddock Pass podcast, looking back to the Thai Grand Prix. And there's a lot to get through on this one, because even though it's just been done and dusted as the perfect weekend for the Marquez family, we've got a lot to break down about why it was a 1-2 for them and what it means for everyone else. So as we look towards what's happening in Thailand, there's no one better to ask the questions to than Adam Wheeler and Neil Morrison, our boots on the ground. And Adam, obviously enough, the opening round of the year, it's always exciting. But what was the atmosphere like in Buriram? It seemed like it was a big crowd today.
Yes, heat-resistant soles needed to the boots, Steve. It was a corker. It was a fryer, that's for sure. I'm not sure if I've ever been at a race quite so intense for heat. I can't remember which rider said it now in the debriefs on Sunday afternoon, but
India.
They said that India was. I think it might be Maverick Vinales actually. Someone said that India was the most intense for heat, and I have to agree. I mean, that was relentless, but then it was a boiler here, and but really busy. I think the official crowd figure was just under 250,000 for the whole entire event.
No, it wasn't. It was 99,000.
No,
it's not. These 3-day
Dave.
figures, we have to stop. It is absolute horseshit. It is. Look, honestly, nearly 100,000 people turning up, and the crowd looked fantastic. You know, it was clearly a fantastic event. But all this double counting is nonsense.
Steve, I think we can feel the tone of the podcast already from the opening minutes.
I'll tell you what, that is the actions of a man a lot like me that's on his 8th cup of coffee of the morning just to try and get through it. And Dave is contrarian as ever, so we're going to keep you quiet for a minute, Dave. And Neil, just this weekend, obviously, the star of the show, everyone's looking at Ogura. And for you, with your background as Moto3 and Moto2 commentator, it's always exciting whenever a new star emerges in the Premier class. It wasn't unexpected that I would have some good results this season, but what he did this weekend, that was impressive, and it's always cool whenever it's on that debut and you're there to see it.
Exactly, Steve. Yeah, I don't think anyone was expecting I to be top Aprilia for a good chunk of this season, really, being honest, at any point this season. But he showed up and made light work of Marco Bezzecchi, made light work of his new teammate, Raul Fernandez. And yeah, I'm sure we'll come on to it later, but yeah, I think the man of the weekend for many people, I think, on the ground here.
And Dave, obviously enough for you, as we've already established, you're very contrarian already at this stage. But when you look at what we saw this weekend, obviously the last time you were in the Grand Prix paddock was at the Sepang test. Is this more or less what you expected to see?
I didn't expect to see Mark being this good. Pecco said, Mark was playing with us today. And he really was. He really was just playing with them. We've been saying before, it's clear that if you put the best rider on the best bike, then there's only really going to be one outcome. But I didn't expect him to be that dominant. But I did enjoy it because I thought it was so interesting. There was a lot of things going on. I don't think it was an exciting race at all, but it was very interesting. There were lots of up and down. Like Ogura is just one of the stories. Bastianini, who honestly I'd written off previously, all of a sudden comes through and has a really solid race. The Yamaha, Jack Miller having a really, really good race. KTM being much worse than I thought. The Aprilia being very strong. There was so much boots on the ground. We're talking about, rubber to the ground, rubber on track. Reveals the reality, and the reality is so much more interesting this year. Honda being good, so many things going on.
Yeah, I always think that when we see that terrible back to school motif at the start of the weekend, MotoGP is one of the only sports where on that first day when you're back in school, you actually get a big exam, and it's to get through to Q2. And, everyone has to be able to hit the ground running, and it always creates something interesting over the course of the weekend. One thing that's also interesting for us is patreon.com/Paddock Pass podcast. And one of the things that we do on that is we've got a predictions thread for our patrons. And it's an opportunity for us to be way off the mark and to see why our patrons are actually quite well informed on MotoGP. And this week we had, who's going to win the sprint, who's going to win the race, how many Ducatis in the top 10, who'll be the top Yamaha, the top Honda rider. and who is Franco Morbidelli going to ruin a weekend of next? And we only had one person that got all of these predictions right. So Rudy Batzel is the person that we're all going to be contacting with to try and get our bets in the row, and then also to figure out our MotoGP fantasy lineups going forward. Because obviously MotoGP Fantasy, the season started for that as well. We've got the Alpine Stars Paddock Pass Podcast Fantasy League, and I think we've got 2,000 players on it now. So it's one of the biggest leagues going in the MotoGP community. So one that's worth signing up to and joining that league, because the overall winner of it will get an Alpine Stars goodie bag at the end of the season as well. The leader...
but Dave's already sussed out the code, Steve. So beware, anybody.
I might have sussed out the code, but I mean, looking at my rank, it's really, really quite rank.
Well, it's just slightly less crap than the rest of us, Dave. So that's not bad. But what is interesting is when you look at all of the top performers in our league, obviously at round one, the top performers across the board always end up with the same teams. But one of our Patreon VIPs, so again, like I said, our very well-informed Patreon users, Brian Deere has topped the charts on round one for us, and 246.5 points isn't a bad haul at all. I'd imagine now there's a boost that's being used there. But when I look at our list, Dave, you're leading the way, position 141.
Oh, what a surprise.
And Neil is up there as well. Sorry, I tell a lie. Dave, you had 141 points. I've bigged you up too much there. You're nowhere. You're only 30 points up on Adam, for God's sake. So you're absolutely nowhere. It's Neil Morrison that's leading the way for us, P313. And Neil, you've got about 20 points in hand on me. But what's good is I've actually got my own team this year. So I've been able to put Ducati in from the outset. So that was a good thing, obviously enough. Also for us on Patreon, at the end of each Grand Prix weekend, we do our Rider of the Day. And Neil, Ogura won our Rider of the Day. I think it was almost 2/3 of the vote for and very well deserved. Obviously enough, a lot of the comments coming in just to say how good of a job he's done. But Neil, when you look at what everyone's saying about I am really interested to know what the overall thoughts in the press room is of his performance this week.
Surprised, Steve, I would say. Yeah, I don't think anyone really saw that coming because his preseason testing campaign was pretty good, but I mean, no one really thought that he was going to end up pushing Pecco Bagnaia really hard in the sprint race on Saturday, finishing just a couple of tenths behind. And yeah, I mean, he was keeping the top four Ducati quartet fairly honest through the majority of the race. He dropped away a little bit at the end, but even to be the best of the rest on the Aprilia, as I said previously, ahead of Bezzecchi, ahead of Raul Fernandez, convincingly so. Yeah, it was just a remarkable performance. And yeah, I know this is one of Ogura's favorite tracks. He's always been brilliant here in the Chang International Circuit in his previous days in Moto2. But even still, to step up and I think score the best rookie result by a MotoGP rookie in his first race since Marc Marquez in Qatar 2013. I mean, that's something that I don't think anyone could have been expecting, least of all I, who said on Saturday that this was as big a surprise to him as it was to, I think, the rest of us.
I think a sign of Ogura's intelligence as well was how much credit, and he cited it twice, in fact, that being behind Pecco Bagnaia in the sprint yesterday, how much he learned from studying what the Italian was doing, how he was conserving tyres. I just think Ogura sort of reminds me of like a small child at the moment. He's just like a sponge. He's absorbing everything that people are saying around him, things that people are doing. And, I think this is a fantastic start, of course. And I hope he doesn't get sort of inundated with a bit of pressure and a bit of expectation. I hope Trackhouse and followers of MotoGP aren't going to assume that the Japanese is going to be fighting top 5 every weekend, because there are going to be moments of adversity. I mean, Neil's point about Ogura being very strong in Buriram is a really good one, because there's going to be much tougher tracks for him. But as a debut, I think he rightfully gets quite a bit of billing and some praise around here.
Yeah, I think sort of the cards fell nicely for him this weekend, in the sense that he was able to follow Bagnaia, and he learnt so much following Bagnaia. He said, like he learned to be really, really smooth, to ride smooth, and that allowed him to save his tyres a lot. but the point is, you actually have to be there. He was fast through the. He was pretty quick in testing. That helped him a lot. He figured out a few things in testing. He figured out a few more things during practice, and then he could learn so much by actually being behind Bagnaia. But like I said, he had to put himself there. He had to qualify, in fifth. So, yeah, just really, really impressive. I think it's also a sign of how good the Aprilia was. Obviously, Bezzecchi messed up his start in the sprint in the sprint race. But, Aprilia had a pretty strong weekend, and it really is looking like Aprilia are the second best manufacturer on the grid at the moment.
Yeah, and it's a little bit like what I think everyone expected from Aprilia, maybe going into last year after how they were 2 years ago. But just in terms of what we have on patreon.com/Paddock Pass podcast as well, we have questions coming in this show from all of our patrons. One of them was maybe a little bit tongue-in-cheek from Stefan, who was asking whether or not he needs to watch a new sport this year, considering the dominance that we saw from Marc Marquez. But David, I want to say this to you because you've been very active on it. Our Discord server is getting more and more popular, and it's almost like a throwback, Dave, for you to when you started out in social media, just being able to use the Grand Prix weekend to just chat to people and give them information.
Yeah, no, it is. It's really. It is. It's really good. I've been keeping an eye on Brian Deer's kids racing in Mora d'Ebre today in the Catalonian sort of local championships. But it's really good. You got really good feedback. It's a fun vibe. It's a very positive vibe as well, which you don't get on a lot of social media platforms. So that was and it's interesting because it does raise. People ask you questions that make you think, which I always enjoy.
Yeah, I think that is one of the big things for art. And one of the questions I was asked was, why am I mates with David Emmett? And that honestly left me scratching my head for a long time. But one question that we asked as well at the end of the Grand Prix weekend was, it's great to see Marc Marquez back to his best, but is that good for the championship? And we got a lot of feedback on this, positive and negative. Morgan was saying, it's great, Marc's got his mojo back. Stefan was saying, it's a worry because I'm a punter and I just want to be entertained. We had Hugo talking about the fact that Marc is your obvious clear favourite for the championship this year. And the reason for that is the ease with which he could control the pace of a world-class field. You just don't see that in Grand Prix racing too often. And then Martin Darlington was also saying that basically Marc is the most complete rider that we've ever seen, and he's proven it once again. But Adam, this was a bit of a strange race for Marc. And obviously the big talking point was the tyre pressure situation for him. And obviously after the race finished and everyone had the chance to chat with him, that seemed to be the big question on everyone's mind.
Yeah, in the press conference, Marc said that, he actually changed his style a little bit for the race because his main objective was to make the start, do the first 2 laps and make the break, pretty much like he did in the sprint. Once he kind of altered his style, then that changed the way that the tyre was reacting to the heat, which was a few degrees less actually on track compared to Saturday. And then, that was why he had to make that mid-race move and let, his brother pass. But, he also said that being able to alter the style and the approach is something that's very rare to do in MotoGP. So it was further evidence of how much superiority he had here this weekend overall. I mean, he made the clean slate across all the sessions. But I mean, such was the dominance on Saturday. I was even asking a couple of riders about, whether it's wise to test and then race at the same venue, in a row. I mean, you can imagine if the factories and the teams sorted out their setups, both in Malaysia and then also in Thailand, and then we went to, say, Portimao, sort of a vastly different kind of track to the ones they've been working at, how much that would mix things up a little bit. Rightly so, the championship works in this way because it's a cost-reducing exercise. Effectively, they bolt all the equipment, the setup, the overseas kind of setup of the paddock away after the test until the Grand Prix comes around. I mean, I do question whether the costs would really be influenced that much because, of course, everyone's flying home after the Thai test and then flying back to Buriram. So it's still quite an exercise for the expenditure. But I'm not sure if this was like a consequence necessarily of the test or the fact that Ducati still have, the best motorcycle and now they just have the best rider ever on it.
It's about the freight costs. That's where the cost is. Flying people is relatively cheap. Flying freight is quite expensive.
yeah, I think it was. I mean, we were all expecting, I think, Mark to win today and to win over this weekend, especially after we saw that pretty fearsome race simulation on the final day of testing in Thailand. But just it was the kind of ease with which he did it that I think was slightly concerning for the rest of the field, and he dominated the sprint race without ever really looking as though he got out of third or fourth gear. I mean, it looked like a sort of a stroll in the park, and he's come away from the first race weekend with a maximum haul of points, and I don't really remember at any point even seeing him look as though he was close to crashing. I mean, even in his most dominant days aboard a Honda, he was all action and all over the place. But this year, he seems to be riding kind of well within his limits and still being devastatingly fast. And yeah, I mean, there was obviously some questions Adam addressed just there about the moment when he did fall behind his brother. Mark was saying that just basically the riding style that he used on the Sunday and in the race was less intense on the brakes because he's trying to conserve a little bit more. And perhaps that, coupled with the fact that the track temperature was slightly down in yesterday, meant that his pressure cooled off. I went to speak to Piero Taramassa from Michelin just to check, is that a viable excuse, or was Mark telling porkies? And he said he hadn't seen the data just yet, but he did say that, the sort of lower track temperature compared to yesterday, and the fact that Mark had adjusted his riding style was probably something that gave that validity. And also Mark was saying that this is still his first weekend with his team, and his team are getting to know him and getting to understand how he rides and how he rides in both the sprint and the feature length races. So it was mightily impressive, and just the ease with which he pulled away from both Alex Marquez and Bagnaia on the penultimate lap after he had passed Alex. I think he put like 1.2 or 1.3 seconds into them in one lap, right at the end of the race when everyone's tires were pretty worn. I mean, that was as big a kind of a slap in the face to his pursuers as anyone could imagine. So, fairly ominous stuff, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about Mark slowing down to go behind Alex, to allow his tire to heat up again, and about him changing his riding style is all of his old data, he said, we set this up based on our data our data from this year. And of course, they all have all of his old data from last year, but his data from last year, he was riding completely differently. He was having to ride so much harder to actually keep up because the GP23 was not as good as the GP24. Now he's on a bike which, he's much more comfortable with. He isn't having to push it. He gets past. One of the interesting comments he made was sort of like, basically, he's being careful on the front end because, it's the front end that you crash. It's the front end that you lose in the race. So he was like being gentle on the front. And that was one of the reasons why his front tire cooled down, cooled down. He got the pressure warning and he had to drop behind Alex.
And it was one of those situations, really, Dave, where we were able to, like I said earlier on, see just that pure dominance from Mark. And it's something we don't see too often. And it reminded me quite a bit. Obviously, the easy comparison is when Rossi was on the best bike back in 2003 and just able to basically play with his food. And it was a lot like that for Mark this weekend. But Adam, you were obviously in the MotoGP paddock back in 2003 when you saw that in reality from Rossi. And then when we see something like this from Mark, it cropped up an awful lot of different memories from the past, obviously, for a lot of people.
Well, Steve, it says a lot that when Marquez did check up coming out of turn 3, I mean, I think even the TV footage cut away to like Gigi Dell'Ingola and the rest of the team, Davide Tardozzi on the pit wall, kind of frozen as if to think, what's happening? Because, Mark had been in such control. I mean, he was essentially riding with one hand on the bars. It was, okay, shit, we were having a technical problem where actually it was further evidence of his superiority because he was just utilizing fantastic racecraft and managing, the whole technical package. It's really worrying that Marquez is on the GP24, fleetingly, comparatively at the start of the season. He's already got a firm grasp of things. I mean, I think, Neil, you and I were talking over dinner, I think it was on Saturday, and we were saying just how relaxed Marquez is, how kind of jovial he is. There's a real relaxed air, and there's all these kind of weird coincidences coming, like, it's 93 GPs since he last led the championship. And of course, when he was last dominant in Buriram was when he wrapped up the 2019 title, which I think very few of us have seen such a dominant season. Even in sort of Rossi's pomp with HRC, there was nothing quite as emphatic as Mark on the Honda in 19. So it is worrying to the point where I really hope that Bagnaia finds something, or Jorge Martin can come back and shake things up, or somebody somewhere does something, because I think Alex Marquez, as good as he is, and clearly as in sync with the GP24 as he is at the moment, I don't think he's going to be able to sort of hold much of a light to his brother.
Yeah, I think Mark said today that it's the kind of the best feeling he has with the bike since Jerez 2020, and we all know what happened then. But that also happened to be one of his most impressive performances, I think, that he's ever produced, which gives an idea of just how good he is feeling. And just the other thing, as Adam mentioned, he came up to his debrief after the sprint success on Saturday. There were already a couple of riders doing their debrief, so what happens in that case is usually a rider goes and stands off somewhere where he isn't going to be bothered by anyone or asked for a selfie or sort of bothered with some nattering from journalists. And Mark's usually very quiet, very focused. Gives you the impression that he doesn't want to be approached when he's waiting for his turn to do his debrief. But yesterday, when he walked into the media center, he was like kind of goofy and laughing and joking and just full of life. And I thought, yeah, I mean, since we've had this new debrief system, since the kind of the series went back to fairly normal circumstances after COVID. I've not seen Mark in this kind of relaxed state of mind. So yeah, I mean, that is another factor as to why he's performing so well.
We had a question in our because honestly, this reminded me not of 2019 but 2014 when Mark won the first 10 in a row, and we had a question in the Discord from TV Room Raccoon saying, "All right, what is the next race, sprint or GP, that Mark won't be on standing on the top step? Because we've got Argentina coming up, slippery conditions, perfect for Marquez. We've got Texas, where he should have won. He wants to win. That he owns that track and he wants it back. Then we've got Qatar, which is a tricky one because he hasn't won since Qatar 2014. There's since 2014, I think. And then Jerez, he's going to win in front of his home crowd. Le Mans. What's the first race that we're not going to see Mark on the top step?
I think Bagnaia is going to be. Yeah, Bagnaia is going to be strong in Qatar, and I would also put a little bit of money on him for Jerez. I mean, he's sort of, remember when he withstood all that pressure from Quartararo a couple of years ago? He's around there also.
Yeah, but I mean, we saw Mark and Pecco fighting it out at Jerez last year, and last year Mark was on a GP23.
Fair point.
I think for me, I'll look to Qatar just because we've already seen in the past Mark lose a lot of those battles in Qatar. He's had only one win, that 2014 win in Qatar in the Premier class. And then he ended up with a lot of, as far as I can remember, a lot of second place finishes, maybe 4 second place finishes. So for me, I think the Qatar sprint, but you'd certainly expect Argentina and then Coda that they're going to be Marquez.
Do we remember how we felt watching the season like in 2019? Because it was formulaic, wasn't it? It was a little static, but you had to be full of admiration for what this athlete was doing on this package. I wonder if we're going to have a similar thing this year. I mean, of course, there's going to be milestone moments. Sorry, no, there's going to be milestone moments all the way. If he wins in Jerez, it's going to be, like you say, very emotional. Remember the scenes last year just from him getting on the podium. If he wins there, it's going to be crazy. The same you could say for sort of Catalonia. If he wins sort of finally at Silverstone. I hope MotoGP this is not the first sign it's going to turn into a bit of a Marc Marquez Borefest dominant year. But, it is kind of worrying.
Yeah, I think with 19, he was obviously dominating the championship, but we still had brilliant racing. And there was that kind of weird run where he kept getting beat on last lap battles, but he was getting beaten by people that weren't close to him in the championship. So it was like Dovizioso in Austria, Alex Rins in Silverstone. I'm pretty sure there was another one somewhere as well. But oh yeah, Petrucci in Mugello. He kept extending his championship lead pretty much in every one of those encounters. So yeah, I still think 2019 was a really exciting year for racing. Maybe not so much in the championship.
Yeah, I think it's one of those ones as well, though. You're able to appreciate just how great someone is when you see Mark back in 2019, because it was only Coda that he wasn't first or second, wasn't it, Neil? And you look at that kind of performance, and you can't help but tip your hat to it, even though it's not an exciting season. But then we look at some seasons in the past. Last year is a good example of it, where we had an exciting championship battle, but we didn't have exciting races.
Exactly.
So which are you looking for? And obviously enough, I'll take exciting races, just sitting on the couch watching in kind of thing. But just to move it on to the other side of the factory Ducati pit box, because one of the big talking points we had from a lot of our patrons was, how does Pecco feel right now? This must be just disastrous. A double world champion in the Premier class, and he's an afterthought for Ducati right now. He's an also ran, and as Adam, as you said, Mark was riding around with one hand on the bars, it looked like at times, and Pecco's giving it everything he has and still can't beat him.
Well, Bagnaia admitted that they had to finish their testing program, or the questions they had from the Buriram test on Friday, and we could see that it was an unsettled time for the team to try and work out how to give Bagnaia an optimal package. And he admitted that it was too late. I mean, effectively losing that day set him on the back foot with Marquez straight away. Yes, Mark has this capabilities, but he's right next door. So, there is an element of sharing and compromise that has to go on. So I think Bagnaia probably is the most learned rival on the MotoGP grid about what Marquez can do on a Ducati at the moment. And, you hope that he's going to sort of apply some of that education. And he said this as much in the press conference, to making an improvement and chipping away at where Mark could be weak. It was the starts to a degree, in 2024, even though Marquez was an expert at barreling back from weaker grid positions. But based on this weekend, it's hard to find much of a vulnerability in the Marc Marquez package. But Bagnaia, he was interesting studying him in the press conference, because a lot of the questions were obviously focused towards Mark and Alex and the whole family dynamic, which was a pretty big thing for MotoGP as well. And when the English version of the press conference finished, there's a new system now where the Spanish and Italian or the native speaking journalists can ask questions. And Pecco just sort of uttered something in Italian to one of the Dorna staffs, as if to say, "Can I go now? Can I be free?" And they were like, "Well, no. Can you hang on for the Italian questions?" And his face was a picture. I think he was already a little bit tired of being a +1 on the Marquez show.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you couldn't really have scripted a worse scenario for Bagnaia, in that he not only had to watch his teammate just dominate him, but he had to watch a guy technically on last year's bike, which is fairly similar to the one he's on now, but on a satellite team that has never really given him too much to think about, and also beaten him. And that just happens to be Marc Marquez, his brother. So yeah, it was sort of double misery, I feel, for Bagnaia. And with the exception of 2023, he does have a habit of being quite slow at the start of championships. You think in 2022, it was only after the Sachsenring where he got going. Last year, it took him until Jerez before we started to see the very best of him. And he simply cannot afford that this year. He has to pick up his game. And if Mark is going to clear off and dominate in Argentina and Cota as we think he is, he needs to make sure that he is getting second places in pretty much every race, because the last thing he wants is having to fight back and recover a 40-point deficit by the time we get to Europe. And I thought one other thing that was very interesting over the weekend, I think it was after the sprint race, when Sky Italia interviewed Gigi Dall'Igna, and Dall'Igna was asked whether Mark's dominance was a result of this track just being better suited to him. And Dall'Igna said, no, this track should be better suited to Bagnaia, and there's going to be tracks coming up where Mark's advantage is going to be much bigger. And I kind of thought, like, that must be so tough for Bagnaia to hear. We know that Gigi is just a ruthless operator, and the fact that he's been the golden boy in that garage for so many years, and and Ducati have rallied around him. Even when there's been another Ducati in a championship fight competing against him, he has always been the guy that has received so much support from the likes of Tolozzi and Dellini, and it must just be galling for him to hear stuff like that coming from Gigi. You know, a guy that he would assume to be his close confidant. And I think there was one session as well. Matt Burt called it quite nicely at the end of it when Dellini was straight over to Marquez at the end of the session, and Matt Burt said, "When was the last time you remember Gigi going to someone in Ducati colours that wasn't Pecco Bagnaia after a session had finished?" So there's a few things which I'm sure are just playing on his mind a little bit, and he knows already that he's up against it. One other quick thing, I think Mark is going from a GP23, which was so inferior to the 24, and getting on even a GP24 after that is so much better. Whereas Bagnaia is still trying to understand exactly where the new bike is better compared to last year's, and he still hasn't quite found that comfort. So it's not like he's jumped on his current package and gone, "Wow, this is incredible." Marquez clearly has. Alex Marquez has as well. Fabio Di Giannantonio was saying today the difference between the GP23 and what he's riding now. I'm forgetting the expression he did, but he said it was like, he was like, "Try and write that into your copy, mate. Try and write that like a movement."
Whoosh.
And exactly, basically just night and day difference. So the fact that Mark is enjoying that, Pecco probably isn't. He's probably still trying to understand, okay, where is this better? How do I have to adapt my style a little bit compared to last year, which was such a good bike for me? I think that's maybe another factor that's causing this slightly slow start to the year.
I like Neil's point, but I think Bagnaia is a much harder mentally than we give him credit for. I think you also have to look in his kind of little support corner. I mean, he has the whole VR46 Academy as well, and Valentino Rossi to sort of lean back on, who was a bit of a mental giant of the game himself. And then he has one of the best crew chiefs in the pit lane. I mean, that's also something you shouldn't sniff at. But having said that, I think one thing Bagnaia urgently needs to address is his sprint feeling, because he's told us on Saturday that he still hasn't got the feeling with the bike that's necessary to push for victory. And if he's going to concede every other Saturday to his teammate, that's going to have not only a cost in the championship standings with a points tally, but also maybe a little bit of mental edge, because, if Mark is just getting one up on him all the time, I think, that was something that Jorge Martin was able to exploit quite well in 2024. He would pop up and show this kind of irrepressible speed to Bagnaia at key moments. And that's also just a little bit of wall of momentum that's hard to break down.
Yeah, I mean, the bike is very, very similar to the GP24. It's got a new swing arm. I think it's got, there's some new suspension parts. It's got a new ride height device. But apart from that, it is very, very similar. They haven't started on working on the chassis or any of the engine performance yet, which they presumably will. They probably won't get that until the Jerez test, and then we'll really start to see a bit of a difference. But the Pecco struggling with the sprint tank is quite interesting, because it's a physically smaller tank. It's a much smaller tank which sits just under the basically under the seat, and the full fuel tank has a little bit of a fuel which sits actually sort of forward. It'll sit just in front of his sort of crotch, if you like, at where you would normally be the tank, because they need that space to actually put the fuel in. And I think the way that the fuel is, the location, because they're trying to put it as close as possible to the center of mass of this thing, the center of gravity of the bike. But they can't do it completely, because the center of gravity is basically the engine. So they're having to sort of move it around to try and find where it is. And that changes just the way that Pecco can brake, and that was where he was really losing. He said he wasn't able to brake the way that he wanted to with the sprint tank, because it feels different, especially when he's following someone else. When he's riding on his own, he can do it. But it's going to be difficult. This might also explain why he was so much weaker in the sprint races last year.
It's interesting, actually, Dave, because that was one of the questions we were asked by Steen on Patreon as well, just to talk about those differences as well. So hopefully you've been able to cover all that for them. One of the other questions we had in was from TV Room Raccoon, and she was asking that, seeing how well Alex Marquez looked this weekend and how well Bezzecchi did on the Aprilia, as well as Mark's pace compared to Pecco now that he's jumped onto the new bike, were we maybe underselling how big of a difference there was between the GP23 and the 24?
I wasn't. I mean, it was fairly obvious because all you needed to do was to look at the gap between Mark and everyone else on the GP23, and everyone else on the GP23 was a long way behind. And just if you think about where Alex Marquez was, if you think about where basically everyone else on that bike was, it was very clear that there was a big gap between the GP24 and the GP23. I think it was Digia who said, it was a completely different world. It's a completely different feel. He said, maybe there's a second in it, maybe not over a single fast lap, but certainly over the distance of a race. Then it was so big that it was a clear advantage.
And just to close off this section of the show as well, Adam, we had a question in from Adrian, and they were asking whether or not we agree with Pecco's assertion that Mark was just playing with the rest of the field in this one. Obviously, you've already talked about this a little bit beforehand, but for Pecco, on the basis of what you saw from him and the fact that you've done a lot of interviews with Pecco over the years, you've spent a lot of time with him. When you look at him, is this the sign of a broken man in Thailand, or how's he going to bounce back in Argentina?
It's definitely not the sign of a broken man, Steve. It's far too early for that as well. But this kind of form by Marquez is not new. I think Bagnaia would have been incredibly naive and stupid to assume that Mark's not going to come in and dominate. I mean, he showed it already on a GP3 in Aragon. That was kind of like a flash of the old genius. And Bagnaia knows very well the resources that Marquez will have to hand. But I think it sets an interesting dynamic. I mean, now there'll be perhaps even more pressure, and Bagnaia is a pressure monster, because he has to show some sort of retaliation, I think. But I don't think we can judge him across the course of a weekend. As Dave's pointed out, I think on our WhatsApp group as well, there's some people that failed to impress in Buriram this weekend, and you can't sort of say that Fabio Quartararo is going to have a terrible season just based on the fact that he had zero grip and couldn't even achieve a lean angle on the Yamaha this afternoon in the main race. So it's still too early.
Yeah, the pressure monster that is Pecco, and Neil Morrison is just a monster. And we're teaming up with Pole Position Travel this year. And one of the things that we're going to do with them is a few weekends we're going to have live shows. We're going to have the opportunity to meet with us, ask us questions. That's going to kick off the Spanish Grand Prix at Jerez at Cherry Park. So the chance to buy Neil a drink and to unleash that monster will be available for everyone. But one of the other options that everyone has as well through the course of the year is to get one of the packages from Pole Position Travel. So for the Qatar Grand Prix, they've got their classic package on polepositiontravel.com. And with this, you'll stay in a 4-star hotel downtown. And you'll also have on their dinner for that weekend, the designer of the Losail International Circuit. So you're able to ask them questions. And this is always something that's very interesting because you're able to see the concepts that go into designing and making a circuit. And that can be everything from how you create overtaking opportunities to the safety of the track to how the pit buildings look. So that's a really cool opportunity to sit down and have a chat and learn a lot about the sport. And then over the course of the rest of the weekend, you get the chance to be on site, and the Pole Position Travel guides really do let you get the most you can from a Grand Prix weekend and experience. So check out polepositiontravel.com for the ultimate race weekend experience. Just to move it on as well, Neil, we haven't heard from you for a while, and we'll come to you about Aprilia and the weekend that we saw. Obviously, we've talked about Ogura, so there was no Jorge Martin, but there's no problem for Aprilia. But one of the big things that we've kind of come away from this weekend is, where would Martin have been? Because the Aprilia looked great. Bezzecchi did a really good job, obviously Ogura, and you would have expected as the number one plate, the reigning world champion, that if we had a fully fit Jorge Martin here, that he would have been thereabouts as well.
It's difficult to say, Steve. I mean, I think if we're talking about Jorge Martin as a rider that had 2 preseason tests under his belt at the start of this year and was already well dialed in coming to the Shanghai International Circuit, then you have to imagine he would have been at least there with Ogura or around Ogura, because we know that he's a fantastically talented rider and he's pretty quick to adapt to new situations. Martin, having missed the 2 preseason tests coming here this weekend, I think would have been a different matter, and we would have seen him a bit further back. But certainly Ogura has given a fine indication of just how good the Aprilia can be. I mean, to finish 7 seconds off Marc Marquez in such a dominant weekend. Okay, Marc was playing with his opposition for a good chunk of the race, but even still, it was a pretty impressive accomplishment, considering this was a horrible track for Aprilia, or has been a horrible track for Aprilia in years gone by. I mean, Bezzecchi obviously indicated that there was potential here when we tested 2 weeks ago, but yeah, for a rookie to be up there, I think shows that there should be some good times ahead. And when you were speaking to all three of the riders, in fact, all four of the riders, Lorenzo Savadori included, they said that the issue with the overheating and becoming almost unrideable because the riders were having legs and arms burnt by a bike that wasn't able to dissipate heat, that issue seems to have been solved. So that is already a pretty good thing. And I think they're pretty clear that their engine is a big upgrade on what they had last year. And I think the aerodynamics have also improved. So, there's definitely reason there for Martin to be watching this weekend's action, looking on and thinking, okay, when I come back, there's something interesting to play with.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's obvious that Martin will be watching and being optimistic, but you can't really say anything about how Martin will have done because it's an entirely hypothetical situation. I remember hearing an American say, if some butts were candy and nuts, then every day would be Christmas. But it ain't Christmas yet, boys.
My word. Just quickly on two things pretty related. The first one, Jorge Martin's absence and also his injury was a little bit of a talking point early in the weekend. I asked Bagnaia and Marquez about it in the Thursday press conference, and I also spoke with Red Bull. They have the Athletes Performance Center, is it the APC? They have a representative here that works with the Red Bull KTM riders, all four of them, an Italian called Flavio Dromi. I've done an interview with him before, but I was asking him about the scaphoid. I said, how kind of tricky is that of an injury, especially for a motorcycle rider? And he was actually giving a pretty detailed breakdown to saying, some of the things we already know because it's sadly a common injury, but because it's right in the middle of a three kind of pivot point movement axis of the wrist, and there's little blood getting to that area of the joint of the anatomy. It's a slow healer, and of course, after surgery you need to immobilize the joint, then have to start work on physiotherapy. And he said it's also a type of injury that can bring you problems further down the road. You might feel you can handle pain and you can ride a motorcycle again, a typical healing period of 4 to 6 weeks after a break and then surgery. But then, 6, 7, 8, 9 months later, you're having more problems with it in terms of, bone degradation, because I think it's a word called osteoporosis. I'm sure there's some people who know a lot more about medical matters than me, probably frowning right now. But then, in short, it's a really tricky injury, and it has to be left to heal in the right way. I'm not too sure on the specifics of what Martin had inserted in the joint, but the direction of the screws, how the direction of the fracture, in fact, all of that is going to affect how the wrist responds to the kind of recovery and rehab he wants to do, and what he's going to need to show on the Aprilia. So I think the key message was, especially from sort of Flavio and from the riders themselves, his peers, was don't rush back. This is not something you could really hurry. He might not be back until, say, Jerez, Le Mans. Take your time because it's quite a serious one. And the other matter about Aprilia, Neil and I are both present. I think, was it Saturday morning, Neil? I can't even remember when it was now. But then Trackhouse showed off their new Golf livery, which was a little bit of a pleasant surprise. We all expected it, of course, and the unveiling of the team colours through testing, and what I think they're going to use from Austin onwards, they're going to change quite a few times, was a little underwhelming. But the Golf livery was definitely cool, and Ogura gave it a decent showcase.
Yeah, I think it's one of those ones that it's a love it or hate it livery. And I remember when I saw it on the BMW at the TT, I didn't like it. I actually quite liked it whenever I saw it on the Aprilia. So that was quite good. We'll move on to the end of our manufacturers for this segment of the show. And KTM and Yamaha, I think, are probably two of the bigger talking points. So, Dave, what can KTM take from this weekend? Because one of the big things we had was obviously Acosta's crash, but they were struggling for much of the weekend.
Yeah, I mean, they were struggling. It does seem like their issues with rear tyre wear was a little better, but if I remember correctly, they were spending quite a lot of Friday working on that. Acosta's crash. You've seen the big tail section on the KTMs. Now, there's talk about that being a mass damper, but it is also about balance. They're really looking at rebalancing bike. Honda have been doing this as well. And Acosta said his crash was caused because the rear unloaded. So he was braking, the rear unloads. There's more weight on the front, but then when he wants to sort of tip the bike in, then there isn't enough weight on the rear, and the rear comes round on him. The rear sort of come around. There's more weight on the front, and then you just wash the front out. That's the issue that KTM are working with. They're trying to fix this vibration issue, but doing that has changed the way the balance of the bike, the weight distribution of the bike, the way that the bike feels. So they're trying to fix one area, and motorcycle design is the way that it is. You try to fix one area and you mess everything up, or you have to sacrifice elsewhere. So you sit around with your little puzzle pieces, sort of shifting them around to try to get them back into some kind of working order. And I think that's where KTM is. I think they've taken a step backwards in the hope that they're going to make a step forward.
Yeah, that was especially true for the case of Brad Binder. His team looked pretty, not concerned, but there were a lot of kind of serious expressions around the pit box this weekend. And Binder, as we've seen, and Maverick Vinales was talking about this also, that the KTM needs to be used in braking in a specific way. And we remember Binder and Jack Miller backing in the RC16 at Jerez quite spectacularly, and the way that these guys were able to manipulate their motorcycle was based a lot on front end feeling. Binder currently doesn't have that. That's what he's trying to find, and that was a reason for his kind of maybe understated performance in Buriram this weekend, because in the extra hot conditions they just couldn't find that usable grip, and he said the bike was understeering a lot. So KTM is a little bit in transition. I think they're looking for a solution to the chatter problems, of course, that they had on the rear end from last year, and like Dave says, it's just they're trying to rebalance the bike, and I think that's going to take an adaptation phase for the likes of Brad, who's been on a KTM for 6 seasons now, and it's something that could go either way.
The tricky thing is that we have these special heat-resistant tyres which have a little bit less grip. They feel a little bit different, and that makes it even more tricky to actually find the right balance of the bike.
Neil, just to bring you in as well, we were asked a question from Ewan just about what happened to the factory Yamahas over the course of this weekend compared to what we saw from them in testing. I know I forgot to ask us all our moments of the weekend at the start of the show, but my moment of the weekend was what we saw from Jack Miller in the qualifying session, because it was a super lap. So we saw some potential from Yamaha, but once we got into the race weekend, obviously for Fabio Quartararo, this was a massively disappointing weekend. What was the story for Fabio?
Yeah, it's funny how quick things can change so quickly, Steve. After Sepang, we were all bigging up Yamaha as if this could be the season in which they become the second. What did you say, Dave? They're going to be the second manufacturer this year behind Ducati.
I'm so glad I wasn't on last week's show, by the way.
I can't remember that. I mean, look, I'm aging. Be gentle with me. My memory is fading. I can't remember saying that, so it can't have been true.
Well, I picked them as my manufacturer for the fantasy team.
What? Why would you do that, Ad? Why would you do that? The only thing that matters is to pick Ducati.
No, I went. I couldn't afford it, and I went to listen back, and I thought I'd take Dave's advice.
Don't worry, Dave. We'll treat you with kid gloves made from real kids, though. But yeah, I mean, it was a terrible start from Fabio, and he just got marred on the first lap, and basically that's the worst thing that can happen here. Just the conditions that we had were probably some of the most extreme that we've ever had in MotoGP. Just being in the middle of that pack meant that you were holding on to a chunk of machinery that was around 100 degrees in temperature. And Alex Rins was talking about, in fact, he was showing off a big red burn that he had in the inside of his thigh. And it just didn't sound present. They had no grip whatsoever. And Fabio said the issues that they've had in the last couple of years, when there's low grip, then Yamaha really struggled to make it work. I did hear an interesting whisper, though, that all MotoGP manufacturers except Yamaha are using Marquez wheel rims, and Yamaha are the exception. And
correct.
And there is a whisper that they are going to be switching to Marquezini because they think that that could be potentially the reason behind some of these grip issues that they've been having. And that was just a whisper I heard coming through the paddock on our way up to record here. But a bit of a reality check for Yamaha. One good thing, though, you would say, is Jack Miller's performance through the weekend. As you mentioned, Steve, really good qualifying performance from Jack. And a decent start to the race, was holding the zone and had a bizarre incident where I think something made his fairing come loose. And knowing how important the aerodynamics on his fairing are to performance, he was then having to basically hold the fairing on with his arms, which was proven to be a really quite physical and difficult operation. So Miller came home in 11th, and we saw him fade back in the second half of the race. But considering the circumstances, it was a fairly admirable effort. So Jack has shown in these challenging conditions in Thailand that the potential was okay, wasn't brilliant, but I think a disappointed day obviously for Yamaha, but reason to think that there are some decent days ahead.
Dave, just in relation to the wheels that Neil's mentioned in changing manufacturers, it's always interesting whenever one team or manufacturer is out in the room with something, because more often than not, it doesn't make any difference. But sometimes it just gives you something, a box you can tick to say, it's not this that's causing the issue.
That's true. What I have heard about the difference between, I think it's OZ, which Yamaha are using, and everyone else is using the Marquezinis. It's the Marquezinis are lighter, and that is one of the reasons that Yamaha having a bit of a problem. Also, Yamaha are struggling with weight generally. I think they've lost a lot of weight off the bike already, but they're still sort of overweight. Again, that's a reason for them going to a V4. But the other thing is, when you think about, for example, suspension, one of the reasons that everyone except for KTM are on Öhlins is because Öhlins just have so much data. Same with brakes. Everyone's on Brembos because no one can catch up to Brembos because Brembo have got so much experience, so much data. They've seen so much. They've got so much mileage on their products. They've seen so many different situations on their products. They understand how the carbon discs work and all the rest of it. Just catching up becomes impossible unless you suddenly change all of the rules. So that's one of the reasons you see these single spec series.
Just to mention as well, obviously one of the big benefits that we have on the Paddock Pass podcast is that we're always in the paddock, and that's why Neil's able to hear whispers like that. So the support that we get from all of our sponsors, rental.com, check out the Fit My Bike tool and just select the make, model, year of your bike and see all the options that you're able to fit on that. That makes a big difference for us being able to get to Grand Prix, get to World Superbike races, and be able to get that little bit of insight that you get just from being on the ground. So it does make a big difference for us. I want your grades for what this weekend was. And it's interesting because I did get one comment and one message from one of our Patreon supporters, and they said, if anyone gives this race more than a 7 out of 10, I'm cancelling my Patreon support. So if you're going to be more than 7, justify your work. So Adam, I'll come to you, Mr. Positive usually with his grades. What's your grade for the weekend?
I'm going to make a 7.1 then. Yeah, it's the first race of the season. I mean, come on. It wasn't a classic by any means, but, we have reason to celebrate the rebirth of Marc Marquez in red. Packed attendance. The people are unbelievable here in terms of their enthusiasm for MotoGP, their friendliness. It's an event with a really distinct flavour. I think as first events go, it's pretty special, and it's going to be, it seems, the opening round of 2026 as well. So what's not to like? I mean, if it was a bit cooler, I think that might have made it a little bit more bearable. But I'm going to give it a good 7 and a bit. 7 and a bit.
Neil, what about you?
What's not to like? Processional racing, 38 degrees. Ambient temperature, just
spicy food.
A spicy. Yeah, Adam has watched my face balloon into tomato colors a couple of occasions this trip as well.
I'm not sure what's more emotional, Neil, watching Ogura perform so well, or some of the chili that he ate on Saturday evening, because the big man was crying on both occasions.
Big man was, exactly. I would probably say a 6.5. Yeah, more or less what Adam said. I mean, it was a cool event, and I always love coming to Thailand. Really good crowd in today. What 99,000 I think was the official number, but certainly
Yeah.
I hear it was a $250,000 over the weekend, Neil.
Sorry, a quarter. Yeah, the official attendance was a 250,000, I should say. So that's great, but yeah, racing wasn't fantastic. And yeah, anytime you stepped outside, I did feel like one of those vampires in the kids' books where I would just make a kind of hissing noise and yeah, dart back off into the dark.
Dave usually makes that noise anyway. But I have to say, for me, I decided to have a Thai meal last night from the takeaway just to try and fit in with Neil and Adam. And like you, Neil, I'll tell you what, I was running after that. The heat was just too extreme for me, so I definitely wouldn't be able to survive a week of eating Thai food. But Dave, what about you for your grade for the weekend?
Well, my wife watched the race this morning, and I asked her because I was interested to know what what her grade was. She basically said like 7-, so basically about the same as Neil. 6.5. Again, positive. Racing's back. It's great. Negative. That kind of racing. The racing was dire. The only interesting thing was Marc Marquez dropping behind his brother Alex to sort of get some temperature back on his tire and get the pressure back up. So yeah, I mean, my mark, I think I would probably give it 6.5, something like that. I mean, 11 out of 10 for atmosphere, 13 out of 10 for racing being back, and 2 out of 10 for the actual racing on track.
Yeah, I think for me, I think if we had seen a little bit more of the battles further down the field, I think a little bit differently about it. But the fact is, we just saw the Marquez brothers.
Much going on.
There
Steve.
wasn't, but you ended up where Bastianini did make progress.
Yeah,
Bezzecchi made progress, and we didn't really see much of it. So maybe if we saw a bit more of that, I'd have a different thought on the weekend. But as it was, waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning to sit down and watch the races, I just thought, no, this isn't justifying the early start. So for me, it was just because it was the first round of the year. I'll give it a little bit of a bump and say 4. So it wasn't doing it for me. But we'll move on to our final talking points of the weekend: the hire, fire, and liar of the weekend. So on the basis of this one weekend, Neil, who are you hiring?
Well, just to prelude this, Steve, this is our former winners and losers section, hire and fire, and then we thought we would add on liar as well to basically describe
have something that rhymes.
Have something that rhymes. First of all, here a Northern Irishman say liar, and
liar.
Also to basically say and tell our viewers who we think has been lying to us over the course of the weekend. Basically, there's always lots of them, so we have plenty to choose from. But my hire was Honda, Steve, because Joan Mir crashed out of a pretty promising position. But Johan Zarco scored his best result for Honda in MotoGP, the 7th position. And it was a pretty positive weekend. Joan Mir felt that he probably could have been up there fighting maybe just behind Ogura. He said top 5 was a realistic ambition for today's race. Luca Marini had a horrible start. I think he had something, he didn't activate his launch control, and that meant that he entered into the first turn last, more or less. So he had a terrible start, but still managed to come through and score okay points for 12th. And Marini was also saying that had that not happened, he felt he could have been running with Zarco and Mir. So it wasn't just like we saw one of the Hondas up there. We saw 3 of them. And even Somkiat Chantru, who I was expecting to be quite some distance off the back, was okay. He wasn't disgracing himself. He had a pretty good performance and was, 30 seconds back at the checkered flag, just over 31 seconds. So, the feeling in Honda continues to be good. They have some issues with their bike overheating a little bit, but I think they have shown that they've definitely taken a massive step forward this year. I think Luca Marini said about a year ago they were 1.3 seconds off per lap to Ducati. Now it's more like 0.8, so that's a big jump over the winter months that they've made. And I think it looks quite promising for Marini, Mir and Zarco for this year.
And Ad, what about you? Who do you hire?
Just a quick retort to Neil's nomination of Mir. Mir did also say in his debrief that riding the Honda today was the most unpleasant experience he's ever had on a motorcycle, just purely because the bike was burning him so much. And I think that also explained why he had a relatively slow crash in turn 12 and just walked away from the thing. There was no chance of him picking up, what was a very hot potato. In contrast to, say, Pedro Acosta, who sort of jumped straight back on the KTM and was setting a pace at the back of the field, which his crew informed him later perhaps would have carried him to the top 5. So there's plenty of merits there, like Neil mentioned, for Honda. But for me, I'll say Franco Morbidelli, who redeemed himself a little bit. He explained that his team advised him to take the soft front tire because he needed to make some moves from that 3-place grid penalty that he had, and his moves in the first few laps were actually probably the only sort of serious kind of action high point of the 26 laps. So Morbidelli had a good race, and we've said many times on the podcast that this is a key season for him to reassert some sort of credentials that he deserves his place in MotoGP, and can rise up again to be the rider that sort of finished runner-up back in 2020. So yeah, I think a nod to Franco, but also Enea Bastianini, as we said. And I think I saw some comments on social media or maybe on Patreon, Steve, just saying, what on earth happened to Bastianini, because he went from obscurity, started 20th on the grid, to finish in the top 10. And he basically just told us that he eased off. He started riding a lot more smoothly. We know that Bastianini is very strong at the end of races and he can preserve tyres well. And that was how it seemed like he finally worked out a trick with a KTM, and it delivered the result. And if that's forward progress and he knows how to tackle the bike from here on in, then we should see a lot more from him.
Yep. And Dave, what about you?
My hire is, it's fairly obvious. It's going to be Ogura, because he just had an absolutely fantastic weekend. Impressive in qualifying, impressive in practice, impressive in the sprint race, learned a lot in the sprint race, understood how to be fast throughout the race by being smooth. And that was what saved him. That was what, that helped put him forward another step. Aprilia have made a really good bike, but Ogura has really, really stepped up. And occasionally you'll see a rider, a bit like Fabio Quartararo, who suits one class of bike better than another. I mean, Casey Stainer was a little bit the same. He was he was a really good 250 rider, but he was just just an amazing MotoGP rider. And it feels like Ogura was, a superb Moto2 rider, but he's also going to be a very, very good MotoGP rider.
Yeah, I think when you look at Ogura's career, that Moto3, Moto2 progression, he was always very smart, and that's gonna serve him very well in MotoGP. Dave, we came to you last for your hiring, so we'll come to you first for who's on the chopping block. Dave, who are you firing?
I am firing Maverick Vinales because he should be beating his teammate, and he is not beating his teammate. Maverick has looked much better than everyone else throughout the season, or throughout pre-season, throughout testing, much better than Bastianini. But Bastianini figured it out. I mean, props to Bastianini. I had sort of like no time for him after the sprint race. He looked terrible, but he looks much better. Like he really turned the corner during the main race today. And Maverick isn't. Maverick is just sort of nowhere again.
And Adam?
Perhaps a bit harsh considering what happened with the rest of the Yamaha riders, but Alex Rins, even though he has a contract, I do feel there's a clock starting to tick slightly louder in his direction, because, to be on a factory team, you have to show something, some flashes of potential speed or form or whatever. And it's been quite some time now since we've seen anything of like Rins's, sort of fantastic style and potential. And there wasn't really too many positives to take away from the weekend.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough for factory rider qualifying on the 8th row of the grid. Definitely should be up on that chopping block. But Neil, what about you? Who's your firing of the weekend?
I'm going to go to Moto3 and pick David Munoz because, he threw away the opportunity, a perfectly good opportunity of fighting for victory, if not victory itself. He made a right mess of that by making a pretty dangerous overtake on Luca Lunetta down into turn 3, which punted Lunetta off, caused him to go through the gravel. He got long lap penalty from that, and then when he tried to serve the long lap penalty, he crashed out of the race. So just, not very clever from Munoz. And then the stewards went back and reviewed the incident with Lunetta, after the race. It turned out the yellow flags were waving when he made that move, and it was deemed that he was putting marshals at severe risk with that manoeuvre, and has then had his penalty upgraded to a pit lane start for the next time that he competes in the GP. So, I did speak to someone from his previous team last year who said that when he gets on a bike, his mind goes blank. And this was another occasion when, the grey matter stopped working and just emotion took over. And he's now in his third full season, and we can no longer cut him the kind of slack that we did in the past for being too young or too inexperienced. I mean, he's expected to win now, and he's still making these stupid kind of mistakes, just too aggressive and not enough thinking.
Yeah, that's very fair. I actually hadn't realised that he had that penalty upgraded. So, very fair cop on that. But Adam, in terms of who's been lying to you this weekend, who's your chief liar? Other than Neil, whenever he said, I'm fine as I'm eating this pad thai.
Yeah, or when he sort of said to us, I can drive us into town, no problems whatsoever. I wasn't holding on, with both hands in the passenger seat. No, I'm jesting.
Knuckles white.
It was I'm jesting. It was a pleasure to be driven around by Mr. Neil Morrison for the first time. Liar, there was a comment right at the end of the press conference which made me kind of smile when Marc Marquez, it was born out of respect, I think. So you have to give him credit for that. But I think it was a Spanish journalist that asked whether, he believed that Bagnaia was still the reference as a Ducati rider now, and he said, "Yeah, completely. Bagnaia is still sort of the one I have to topple." And you kind of thought, "Really, mate? After this weekend and the statement you just made, and even like I think Neil was pointing out the story about Gigi Dillinger as well, showing obvious signs of his new favourite. It does seem that." Marc is now pretty much, I don't want to say top dog because Bagnaia has an immense and long history at Ducati, but in terms of performance, certainly, he is wearing the red plate as championship leader, and he's the main man. So it wasn't kidology, it wasn't mind games. I think it was an instantaneous reaction out of respect. But I did think, come on, Marc, I think you're pretty much close to being the A man there.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. Dave, what about you? Who's your chief liar?
Just a quick thing on what Neil said about Gigi Dall'Igna going over to see Marc first. Ducati's very much their credo is very much, what have you done for me lately? So, they support winners and they completely blank losers. So, and second is just first loser, let alone third. So there you go. My particular liar is Raul Fernandez, who he didn't have time to do a debrief, but he did send an audio note from Maria, the PR person from Trackhouse, and he basically said he had to retire because he said basically the front tire was overheating, but he said it was a really good, he really enjoyed the weekend. We're doing really well. We're going to really I'm really happy with how everything went, apart from having to retire, which to me, he got his arse handed to him by his teammate. The bike is obviously very, very good, and Raul was not where he should be.
Yeah, I think we'll probably have Raul in the firing list a few times as well through the course of the year from Dave. But Dave, Neil, what about you? Who is your liar of the weekend?
Well, what was the original idea you had for this section, Dave? Fire? Oh no, it was hire, fire, and retire. Yeah, and then we realised that Dave would just choose Raul for retire every week. So we thought it's probably best to not completely burn our bridges with the Trackhouse team. So my liar was Lorenzo Savadori, just for the simple fact that I asked him if he's preparing himself to come to more races beyond Argentina, and he kind of gave me a look as if to say no. He basically said no, it's just Argentina for the time being, indicating that Martin might well be back in Austin, even though I think pretty much everyone in the paddock knows that's fairly unrealistic. So Sava, whose English has come on quite a lot and has been a very faithful testing steed for Aprilia. I think he was maybe telling a little porky with that.
I don't think so, Neil, because it is Argentina for the meantime, because that's the next one, and then in Argentina he'll be talking about Coda, so that's okay. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Just to move it on as well, to wrap up our show for the weekend, obviously enough, Patreon.com/Paddock Pass podcast is where we've got an awful lot of our additional content. But one of the things we also have on that is our big competition to kick off the year, 2 Paddock passes to the Grand Prix of the Americas at Coda. So sign up as an annual Paddock Insider. That's $120 per year. But for that, you get so much additional content, lots of World Superbike content for myself and Gordo, but huge amounts of MotoGP content as well, including the Paddock Note Show. And the Paddock Note Show was really interesting over the course of this weekend because, obviously enough, from each day of action, we've been able to talk to all the riders, get their insight, and then bring it to everyone on a short show, 15 to 20 minutes long. But it's also got a little bit on Moto2 and Moto3. And Adam, you actually talked a little bit on the Paddock Note Show earlier in the week about Triumph's new gearbox in Moto2. And it was interesting just to get a little bit of insight into the intermediate class as well. And obviously, with Neil on the pod, we get a lot of extra info for Moto2 and Moto3. So check out patreon.com/Paddock Pass podcast to enter our competition, but also to get your Paddock Note shows through the course of the season. We also had on this show lots of content generated from our Patreon supporters, whether it was on the Discord channel or whether it was just the questions and comments from posts during the course of the weekend. So check that out on Patreon from us. And Adam, just for our upcoming shows as well, obviously, I'm going to be busy now next week. I'm out to Daytona for the Daytona 200, but myself and Gordo have got an upcoming show with Remy Gardner for World SBK. And we've also got plenty from the Grand Prix paddock coming up.
Yeah, we'll have our GP show next week, Steve, and I managed to get a 15-minute interview with Dan Rosselmondo, the CCO of Dorna. He talks about a variety of subjects, most prominently the Liberty Media acquisition and what's going on with that. Why has there been a delay? Is an expected delay? Is there any danger to the deal? Those kind of questions will be answered. About a second USGP, the Fox Sports TV deal for US viewers. Just a few things. It was quite sort of interesting and revealing. So that's all edited and ready to go. So that'll be in the show next week. And as you mentioned, we just got plenty of content coming up, and I think we're all going to be working the Argentine Grand Prix from home, but then that should be pretty much the last round where I think we won't actually be in the paddock, because then we'll be heading to Austin, Qatar, and then starting the European stint in the calendar.
Yeah, and once we start in Europe, that's whenever it really does tend to get very busy. But like I said earlier on with Pole Position Travel, we're going to have a few live shows as well. So the Jerez Grand Prix and then Silverstone are 2 shows that we've got planned for that. So that's going to be exciting. So check that out on polepositiontravel.com. And as ever, a big thank you to Rental Street for supporting us on the podcast. Check out rental.com to see all the products that they have available. And like I said, a big thank you to everyone on Patreon that supports us on patreon.com/Paddock Pass podcast. We're going to let Neil and Adam find their way to a pad thai or a chicken and cashew. And we're going to let Dave get himself back for a little bit of a nap before he has to write 5,000 words on why Marc Marquez was as dominant as he was. But as Adam said, we'll be back next week on the Paddock Pass podcast with that interview with Dan as well. So we're looking forward to bringing that to everyone.